Look at Grandma Rose with her ancient purse. My daughter-in-law Sabrina whispered loud enough for the entire coffee shop to hear. Someone should tell her that bag went out of style when dinosaurs roamed the earth. The young mothers at the neighboring table erupted in giggles, their designer handbags perched like trophies on their laps. I clutched my worn leather satchel a little tighter and pretended I hadn't heard them, though the familiar sting of humiliation burned in my chest. If only they knew what that old purse really contained. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday at Riverside Elementary School, where I volunteered in the library twice a week. At 73, I'd been coming here for nearly 5 years, ever since my husband Frank passed away and left me with too much time and too many memories rattling around our empty house. The children loved story time with Mrs. Rose, and their bright faces were often the highlight of my week. Today was different, though. Today was the autumn carnival planning meeting, and somehow I'd been roped into attending by Mrs. Patterson, the energetic PTA president who had a talent for making requests sound like royal decrees. The meeting was held at Brewster's Cafe, the trendy new establishment that had replaced the old diner where Frank and I used to share coffee and apple pie every Sunday after church. I felt out of place the moment I walked through the glass doors. The other women were all younger, dressed in expensive athletic wear that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, clutching phones that looked like they could run NASA. Their conversations buzzed with talk of organic this and gluten-free that, interrupted by the occasional shriek about someone's new kitchen renovation or husband's promotion. My own appearance was modest by comparison. I wore a simple blue cardigan that I'd had for at least a decade, paired with comfortable slacks and sensible walking shoes. My silver hair was pulled back in the same neat bun I'd worn for 40 years, and my only jewelry was Frank's wedding ring, which I wore on a chain around my neck. But it was my purse that drew the most attention, or rather, the most ridicule. The leather satchel had been a gift from Frank on our 25th wedding anniversary. It wasn't expensive or fashionable even then, but it was practical and sturdy, with multiple compartments and a reliable clasp. Over the years, it had carried everything from Band-Aids for scraped knees to tissues for tears, from grocery lists to birthday cards. The leather had darkened with age and wear, developing a patina that spoke of countless adventures and everyday moments. To me, it was beautiful in its functionality and history. To the younger women, it was apparently a source of endless amusement. Sabrina, my son Marcus's wife of 8 years, had been particularly vocal about her disapproval of my fashion choices lately. Ever since Marcus got his promotion to regional sales manager at the medical supply company, she'd been pushing for changes in the family's image. New house, new car, new circles of friends, and apparently, new standards for what the family matriarch should look like in public. "Rose, darling," she'd said just last week during Sunday dinner, her voice dripping with false concern. "Maybe it's time to update your look a little. I'd be happy to take you shopping for something more contemporary." Her emphasis on the word contemporary made it sound like I was a museum exhibit that had been accidentally let loose in the modern world. I'd politely declined then, just as I'd declined her previous offers to help me modernize my wardrobe, redecorate my house, and update my hairstyle. Some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the weapons being used against you were disguised as kindness. But sitting in that coffee shop, surrounded by women half my age who treated me like an amusing relic, I felt the familiar weight of invisibility that seemed to settle on women of my generation like dust on forgotten furniture. We became background characters in our own lives, tolerated rather than valued, humored rather than heard. The meeting itself was a blur of discussions about booth assignments and volunteer schedules. I found myself assigned to the book sale table, which was fitting since books had always been my refuge. When the official business concluded, the conversation shifted to more personal topics, and that's when the real entertainment began. "Did you see the Hendersons? New edition?" asked Jennifer Walsh, a petite blonde whose husband owned 3 car dealerships. The contractor said it added at least $200,000 to the value of their property. "I'm thinking we might need to do something similar to keep up." "Property values in Maple Ridge have gone absolutely insane," chimed in another voice. "We bought our house 3 years ago for $450, and the realtor says it's worth at least $620 now. It's like printing money." Maple Ridge. The mention of that subdivision made me shift uncomfortably in my chair. I knew Maple Ridge very well, though I'd never mentioned that to anyone in this group. The conversation continued to swirl around real estate values, renovation costs, and the general financial prosperity that seemed to define their lives. The worst part is finding decent rental properties, Sabrina said, stirring her almond milk latte with unnecessary vigor. Marcus and I have been looking for investment properties, but everything decent is either overpriced or in terrible neighborhoods. We need something that will attract quality tenants, you know? Young professionals, families who take care of things. Several heads nodded in agreement. The rental market had become a popular topic among this crowd, as more and more families looked for ways to generate passive income in an uncertain economy. We've been looking at Oakwood Commons, said Jennifer. Those townhouses are perfect for young couples just starting out. Close to downtown, good schools nearby, safe neighborhood. If we could get our hands on a few of those properties, we'd be set for life. Oakwood Commons, another name that made my pulse quicken slightly, though I kept my expression neutral as I sipped my plain black coffee. The problem is availability, continued another woman whose name I hadn't caught. Those properties almost never come on the market. It's like whoever owns them is holding on to them forever. My realtor says there's some kind of private ownership situation that makes it nearly impossible to buy in there. I set down my coffee cup carefully, making sure it didn't rattle against the saucer. My hands were steadier than they'd been in years, despite the storm of emotions brewing in my chest. What about Riverside Gardens? Asked Sabrina. Those condos are gorgeous, and the location is perfect. Close to the country club, walking distance to that new shopping center. Marcus keeps talking about how we should get in there before prices go up even more. Riverside Gardens, the third property mentioned in as many minutes, and the third name that was etched permanently in my memory. Good luck with that, laughed Jennifer. My brother-in-law is a real estate attorney, and he says Riverside Gardens has been tied up in some kind of complex ownership structure for years. Apparently, there's an old woman who controls most of the development through some trust arrangement. She won't sell to anyone, no matter what they offer. The room filled with sympathetic murmurs about the frustrations of dealing with elderly property owners who didn't understand market forces or the needs of younger families. It's so unfair, said Sabrina, her voice taking on the petulant tone she used when she didn't get her way. These old people sitting on prime real estate while young families can't find anywhere decent to live. They should be forced to sell if they're not using the properties productively. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The casual cruelty of dismissing entire generations of people as obstacles to be moved aside was breathtaking in its thoughtlessness. The worst part, continued Jennifer, is that most of them don't even understand what they have. My realtor told me about this old lady who owns half of downtown Millbrook. She comes to the grocery store in clothes from the thrift shop and drives a car that's older than my teenager, but she's sitting on millions of dollars in real estate. It's like she doesn't even know what she's worth. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I found myself only half listening. My mind was elsewhere, calculating and remembering, pulling together threads that these were.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Women couldn't see but that were about to become very important to their futures. When the meeting finally ended, I gathered my things slowly, waiting for the younger women to leave first. Sabrina paused at my table, her expression a mixture of pity and condescension that I'd grown to know well. Rose? Are you all right? You seem a little distracted today. Just tired, dear, I replied, slipping the strap of my old leather purse over my shoulder. All this talk about real estate and property values. It's not really my world. She smiled indulgently. Of course not. But don't worry about any of that. Marcus and I will make sure you're taken care of. We've been talking about maybe helping you find a nice senior community when you're ready. Something more manageable than that big old house. I nodded politely, as I always did when she made these veiled suggestions about my future living arrangements. That's very thoughtful of you, Sabrina. It's just that maintaining a house at your age must be such a burden, she continued, apparently encouraged by what she mistook for agreement. And Marcus worries about you being alone in that big place. We want what's best for you. What's best for you? the phrase that had become code for what's most convenient for us. I'd heard it more and more frequently over the past year, usually in connection with suggestions that I downsize, simplify, or otherwise make myself less of a complication in their upwardly mobile lives. "I appreciate your concern," I said, standing up and smoothing down my cardigan. "I should head home now. These old bones need their rest." Sabrina's laugh was bright and hollow. "Oh, Rose, you're so funny with your old-fashioned expressions. See you Sunday for dinner?" "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, though part of me wondered if that was entirely true. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through downtown Millbrook's historic district. The streets were lined with mature oak trees just beginning to turn their autumn colors, and the old Victorian houses stood like dignified sentinels against the encroachment of modern development. This was the neighborhood where Frank and I had dreamed of living when we were young, before practical considerations and limited budgets directed us toward more modest accommodations. My own house sat on Elm Street, a quiet residential road that had been developed in the 1960s. It was a simple 3-bedroom ranch-style home with a large backyard and a 2-car garage that Frank had converted into a workshop years ago. The mortgage had been paid off decades earlier, and while the house wasn't fancy, it was comfortable and filled with 45 years of memories. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the familiar facade. The shutters needed painting, and the front porch could use some new boards, but the foundation was solid and the roof was relatively new. Sabrina was right about one thing. It was a lot of house for one person. But it was my house, and despite their concerns about my ability to maintain it, I'd managed just fine for the 5 years since Frank's death. Inside, I made myself a cup of tea and settled into Frank's old recliner in the living room. The chair had been his domain for 20 years, positioned perfectly to watch television while keeping an eye on the bird feeder outside the window. I'd resisted the urge to sit in it for months after his death, but eventually, the comfort of feeling close to him had outweighed the sadness. My old leather purse sat on the side table next to the chair, looking innocent enough, despite the ridicule it had endured that morning. I opened it slowly, running my fingers over the familiar contents. Tissues, reading glasses, a small address book with phone numbers I'd memorized years ago, a few dollars in cash, and my checkbook with its careful record of modest transactions. But tucked into the zippered compartment at the back, protected by a small manila envelope that had grown soft with age, were the documents that would have made those coffee shop queens reconsider their assumptions about the helpless old woman with the outdated accessories. Property deeds. 7 of them, to be exact. Each one properly recorded with the county clerk's office, each one representing years of careful investment and patient planning. Frank had started buying real estate in the 1970s, back when properties in desirable locations could still be purchased by people with middle-class incomes and long-term vision. He'd never been flashy about it. We'd continued to live in our modest house, drive used cars, and shop sales at the grocery store. But quietly, steadily, he'd built a portfolio of rental properties that generated enough income to support us comfortably while growing in value year after year. When Frank died, I'd inherited not just our family home, but 7 rental properties in 3 different developments around Millbrook. Properties in Maple Ridge, Oakwood Commons, and Riverside Gardens. The same developments that the women in the coffee shop had been discussing with such longing and frustration just hours earlier. I pulled out the deed to 1247 Maple Ridge Lane, a 3-bedroom colonial with a 2-car garage and a small backyard. According to my property management company, it was currently rented to a young couple named Derek and Jennifer Walsh. Derek owned 3 car dealerships, and Jennifer spent her days planning renovations and discussing property values at coffee shops. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. I reached for the phone and dialed the number for Hartwell Property Management, the company that had been handling my rentals for the past 3 years. Sandra Hartwell answered on the second ring, her voice warm and professional. "Rose, how lovely to hear from you. Is everything all right with the properties?" "Everything's fine, Sandra. I was actually calling to ask about my tenants. How are they doing with their lease obligations?" Oh, they're all current on rent, if that's what you're wondering about. Though I have to say, we've been getting quite a few complaints lately about late payments and difficult behavior from a few of them. Nothing serious enough to warrant eviction, but enough to make managing them a bit challenging. I wasn't surprised. The rental market had shifted dramatically over the past few years, with demand far exceeding supply. Tenants who might have been more careful about maintaining good relationships with their landlords had grown complacent, assuming they held all the power in the arrangement. "What kind of complaints?" I asked. "Oh, the usual. Demanding immediate responses to minor maintenance requests, threatening to move out if we don't comply with unreasonable demands. That sort of thing." The couple in Maple Ridge has been particularly difficult. They've been hinting that they expect rent reductions because they claim the property values in the neighborhood have declined, which is absolutely ridiculous. That area has appreciated faster than anywhere else in Millbrook. The couple in Maple Ridge, Derek and Jennifer Walsh, who spent their mornings discussing investment properties and complaining about elderly landlords who didn't understand market forces. "Have they been good tenants otherwise?" I asked. "Technically, yes. They pay on time, though always with some complaint about the amount. They've made several unauthorized modifications to the property without asking permission first. Last month, they installed a hot tub on the deck without checking with us. When we told them it violated their lease terms, they said they were improving the property value and we should be thanking them." I shook my head, though Sandra couldn't see me. The entitlement was breathtaking, but not entirely unexpected given what I'd observed that morning. "Sandra, I'd like to schedule a time to review all of my properties and tenant situations in person. When would be convenient for you?" "Of course. Is there something specific you're concerned about?" "Let's just call it a periodic review. I think it's time I took a more active role in managing my investments." We scheduled a meeting for the following Thursday, and I hung up feeling more energized than I had in months. For too long, I'd been content to let others handle the details of my financial life, just as I'd let Frank manage most of our investments during our marriage. But recent events had reminded me that passive participation in your own affairs was a luxury that could be revoked without warning. The rest of the week passed quietly. I went through my usual routines, volunteering at the library, tending to my small garden, and having lunch with my neighbor Eleanor, who was the only person in my life who remembered me as someone other than Marcus's aging mother or the old lady with the outdated purse. Eleanor had been Frank's colleague at the insurance agency where they'd both worked for over 30 years. She was 2 years younger than me, but infinitely more outspoken about the way society treated older women. "They think we're invisible," she said over chicken salad sandwiches in her sunny kitchen. Or worse, "They think we're incompetent." My own grandson tried to explain to me how to use email last week, as if I hadn't been sending emails since before he was born. I told her about the coffee shop incident, though I left out the more interesting details about my property ownership. Eleanor's indignation was immediate and fierce. "Those girls wouldn't last 5 minutes dealing with what we've managed over the decades," she said. "They think life started when they graduated college, and everything before that was just prologue. Wait until they hit menopause and watch how quickly the world starts treating them like furniture." "The thing that bothers me most," I said, "is how they assume incompetence based on appearance, as if wisdom and experience are disqualifications instead of assets." "It's because they're afraid," Eleanor replied with the certainty of someone who'd spent 71 years observing human nature. "They're afraid of aging, afraid of becoming irrelevant, afraid of losing their looks and their status. So they project all of that fear onto us, as if we're some kind of cautionary tale instead of women who've lived full, complex lives." Her words stayed with me as I prepared for my meeting with Sandra Hartwell. On Thursday morning, I dressed carefully in my best suit, a navy blue ensemble that Frank had always said made me look like I could run a corporation. I pinned my hair up neatly and chose my smallest, most conservative earrings. But I carried the same old leather purse that had caused so much amusement earlier in the week. The offices of Hartwell Property Management occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian building in downtown Millbrook. Sandra had decorated the space with an eye for both professionalism and comfort, and she greeted me with the genuine warmth that had made me choose her company 3 years earlier. "Rose, you look wonderful," she said, gesturing toward a comfortable chair in her private office. "I've pulled together all the files for your properties. I think you'll be pleased with how well they've performed over the past year." We spent the next 2 hours reviewing each property in detail. The financial performance was indeed impressive. My 7 properties had generated over $80,000 in rental income the previous year, after expenses and management fees. The property values had continued to appreciate, with the total portfolio now worth well over $2 million. But it was the tenant profiles that proved most interesting. Sandra had compiled detailed information about each renting family, including employment history, rental payment records, and notes about their behavior as tenants. The Walsh family in Maple Ridge had been model tenants for the first 2 years of their lease, but their attitude had shifted dramatically over the past 6 months. They'd begun making demands for property improvements while simultaneously complaining about rent increases that were well within the normal market range. They seemed to think that because they take good care of the property, they deserve special treatment, Sandra explained. Last month, Jennifer called to demand that we install granite countertops because she'd seen them in other houses in the neighborhood. When I explained that cosmetic upgrades weren't typically provided by landlords, she said she'd start looking for other options. "And have they found other options?" I asked. "That's the interesting part. They've been looking for months, but nothing in their price range meets their standards. They want to live in Maple Ridge, but they can't afford to buy there, and there aren't any other rental properties in the neighborhood. So they're stuck, but they're not happy about it." I made a note in the margin of their file. "Stuck, but not happy about it" seemed to sum up the attitude I'd witnessed at the coffee shop meeting. The situation with my other tenants followed similar patterns. Most of them were good people, caught between rising housing costs and stagnant incomes, grateful for the opportunity to live in desirable neighborhoods, even if homeownership remained out of reach. But a few had developed the kind of entitlement that comes from forgetting that housing is a privilege, not a right. "Sandra, I'd like to make some changes to how we handle tenant relations," I said as we concluded our review. "I want to take a more active role in the management decisions, particularly when it comes to lease renewals and tenant behavior issues." "Of course. What did you have in mind?" "I think it's time some of my tenants remembered that maintaining good relationships with their landlord is in their best interest. Sometimes people need gentle reminders about respect and appreciation." Sandra's expression grew curious, but she nodded. "Would you like to start with any particular property?" I thought about Jennifer Walsh's voice from the coffee shop. These old people sitting on prime real estate while young families can't find anywhere decent to live. They should be forced to sell if they're not using the properties productively. "Let's start with Maple Ridge," I said. "I think the Walsh family and I need to have a conversation." Sunday dinner at Marcus and Sabrina's house was a weekly tradition that I'd maintained even when it became more obligation than pleasure. Their home in the Westfield subdivision was exactly what I'd expected when Marcus got his promotion. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen that Sabrina photographed for social media, and a mortgage payment that kept them awake at night even though they'd never admit it. I arrived at 5 o'clock sharp, carrying a homemade apple pie and wearing the same blue cardigan that had drawn snickers at the coffee shop. My leather purse sat on the passenger seat of my 10-year-old Honda Civic, loaded with the same documents that would have surprised my coffee shop critics. "Rose!" Sabrina's greeting was as bright and artificial as ever. "You didn't have to bring pie. I made a quinoa salad and grilled vegetables. We're trying to eat more mindfully these days." I smiled and handed her the pie anyway. A little dessert never hurt anyone. Marcus appeared from the kitchen, looking tired in the way that successful middle-aged men often do when the responsibilities of their ambitions begin to weigh on them. He hugged me briefly, and I caught a whiff of the expensive cologne that Sabrina had given him for his birthday. "Hey, Mom, how was your week?" "Quite eventful, actually. I had some interesting meetings about my investments." Both Marcus and Sabrina looked surprised. In the 5 years since Frank's death, I'd rarely mentioned financial matters, leaving them with the impression that I was living modestly on Social Security and whatever small savings Frank had left behind. "Investments?" Sabrina's voice held a note of confusion. "I didn't know you had any investments. Your father was quite careful about planning for my future," I said, settling into their living room sofa. I'm just now beginning to understand how thorough he was. Marcus looked uncomfortable, the way he always did when conversations touched on his father's continuing influence on my life. He'd spent the past few years trying to position himself as my primary advisor and protector, despite having minimal knowledge of my actual circumstances. Mom, you know, if you need help understanding any financial stuff, I can look at it for you. My promotion comes with some pretty good benefits, including access to financial planning services. That's very sweet, dear, but I think I'm managing just fine. Dinner conversation followed its usual patterns. Sabrina discussing her various social activities and home improvement projects, Marcus talking about work challenges and office politics, and me listening politely while my mind wandered to more pressing matters. It wasn't until dessert that the conversation took an interesting turn. "Oh, Rose, I meant to tell you," Sabrina said, cutting herself a small slice of my apple pie despite her earlier comments about mindful eating. "I ran into Jennifer Walsh at the gym yesterday. She mentioned that she'd met you at the PTA carnival planning meeting." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Yes, she seems like a lovely young woman." "She is, and so stylish. Did you see that gorgeous handbag she was carrying? It was one of those designer pieces that costs more than most people spend on rent." Sabrina laughed at her own observation, apparently missing the irony. "We were talking about real estate," she continued. "Jennifer and Derek have been looking for investment properties, just like Marcus and I have. It's so frustrating how limited the options are in this market." Marcus leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What kind of properties are they looking for?" "Rental properties, mainly. Something in a good neighborhood that would attract quality tenants." Jennifer was saying how impossible it is to find anything in places like Maple Ridge or Riverside Gardens. Apparently, most of the good properties are tied up by some old landlords who won't sell no matter what people offer. I set down my fork carefully. Did she mention any specific properties? She was particularly frustrated about this one house in Maple Ridge that they're renting. Apparently, the landlord is some elderly woman who won't invest in improvements but won't sell either. Jennifer said they've been trying to negotiate better lease terms, but the management company just keeps giving them the runaround. Marcus shook his head sympathetically. "That's the problem with dealing with older property owners. They don't understand modern market dynamics or what tenants expect these days." "Exactly." Sabrina's voice rose with enthusiasm. "Jennifer said they've been model tenants, taking excellent care of the property, even making improvements on their own dime. But when they asked for reasonable things like updated appliances or permission to renovate the kitchen, they got told no." I found myself genuinely curious about this version of events. What kind of improvements did they make? "Oh, just common sense upgrades." They installed a hot tub, updated some of the lighting fixtures, replaced the carpet in the bedrooms. Things that actually increase the property value. But instead of being grateful, the landlord got upset about unauthorized changes. The gap between perception and reality was even wider than I'd imagined. In Jennifer's version of events, she and Derek were generous tenants who deserved appreciation for their unauthorized modifications to someone else's property. "It's really a shame," Marcus added, warming to the topic. "Properties like that should be in the hands of people who understand their potential, not elderly owners who are just sitting on assets they don't know how to manage properly. Maybe the elderly owner has reasons for her decisions that younger people don't understand," I suggested mildly. Sabrina waved her hand dismissively. "What reasons could there be? If you own real estate, you should either improve it and rent it properly, or sell it to someone who will. Hoarding property while younger families struggle to find decent housing is just selfish." The casual cruelty of her statement took my breath away, but I managed to keep my voice steady. Perhaps she's managing it exactly as she intends to. "But that's the point," Marcus said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when he thought I wasn't grasping something important. "Intention isn't enough. You have to understand market forces and tenant expectations. You have to be willing to invest in improvements and respond to changing needs." I nodded thoughtfully. "You're both absolutely right. Property owners should definitely understand their markets and respond appropriately to tenant behavior." Something in my tone must have registered with Marcus, because he looked at me more carefully. Mom, is there something specific you wanted to discuss? You seem like you have something on your mind. As a matter of fact, I do. I reached for my old leather purse, the same bag that had provided such entertainment for his wife and her friends just days earlier. I wanted to share some news about my financial situation. Both Marcus and Sabrina leaned forward, their expressions shifting from polite interest to genuine attention. I opened the zippered compartment and pulled out the manila envelope that contained my property deeds. Your father left me in a much stronger position than I think either of you realized. I spread the 7 deeds across their expensive coffee table, watching their faces as they processed what they were seeing. Property deeds? Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. 7 properties, to be exact. In Maple Ridge, Oakwood Commons, and Riverside Gardens. I picked up the deed for 1247 Maple Ridge Lane and handed it to Sabrina. I believe you know some of my tenants. Sabrina's face went white as she read the address. Her hand trembled slightly as she passed the deed to Marcus, who stared at it as if it might disappear if he blinked. You own Jennifer and Derek's house? He asked. I own Jennifer and Derek's house, I confirmed, along with 6 others. Your father started buying rental properties in the 1970s, and I inherited them when he passed away. The silence that followed was profound. I could practically see the mental calculations happening behind their eyes as they tried to reconcile the image of the helpless widow with the reality of the property portfolio spread in front of them. But you never said anything, Sabrina whispered. You live so modestly. You drive that old car, wear the same clothes, carry that ancient purse. I live comfortably within my means, I replied. Just because I can afford expensive things doesn't mean I need them. Marcus was studying the other deeds now, his expression growing more stunned with each property address. Mom, do you have any idea what these are worth? According to my property management company, the total portfolio is valued at approximately $3 million. It generates about $80,000 in annual rental income after expenses. The numbers hit them like a physical blow. Sabrina actually gasped, her hand flying to her chest. $3 million? Marcus's voice cracked slightly. And you never told us? You never asked, I pointed out. You both seemed quite certain that you understood my financial situation already. But this changes everything, Sabrina said, her voice gaining strength as she began to process the implications. Rose, you could sell just one of these properties and live like a queen for the rest of your life. You could travel, buy a beautiful condo, get a whole new wardrobe. I could do those things, I agreed. But I'm quite content with my life as it is. Marcus was still staring at the property deeds as if they might be forgeries. Mom, I don't understand. Why didn't Dad ever mention this? Why didn't you tell us after he died? Your father was a private man when it came to finances. He believed in living below our means and keeping our business to ourselves. As for why I didn't tell you after he died, well, it didn't seem relevant. You both appeared to have your own lives well in hand. But we could have helped you manage all this, Marcus protested. Property management, investment decisions, tax planning. This is complicated stuff for someone who's never dealt with it before. I couldn't help but smile at his assumption that I'd been stumbling through the darkness without guidance. I have excellent professional help, dear. Sandra Hartwell has been managing the properties for 3 years, and my accountant and attorney have been handling everything else. I'm quite well taken care of. Sabrina was still fixated on the lifestyle implications. Rose, with this kind of money, you could live anywhere you wanted. That little house on Elm Street must seem so cramped now that you know what you could afford. Actually, it seems just right. It's paid for. It holds all my memories with your father, and it's perfectly adequate for my needs. But the maintenance, the upkeep, Marcus said, falling back on his familiar arguments about my living arrangements. Wouldn't it make more sense to downsize to something more manageable and invest the proceeds? I'm comfortable where I am, I said firmly, both financially and personally. The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus and Sabrina trying to understand how their assumptions about my life had been so completely wrong. They peppered me with questions about the properties, the tenants, and my long-term plans, but I could see them struggling to reconcile the new information with their established beliefs about my capabilities and needs. It wasn't until I was preparing to leave that Sabrina brought up the topic I'd been waiting for. "Rose, about what I said earlier, about Jennifer and Derek's situation. I had no idea you were their landlord." "I gathered that," I said mildly. "The thing is, they really are good tenants. They take excellent care of the property, and they've made some improvements that probably increased its value." "Unauthorized improvements," I corrected, "which violated their lease terms." Marcus stepped in, his voice taking on the diplomatic tone he used in difficult business negotiations. "Mom, I know you have every legal right to enforce your lease terms. But from a practical standpoint, wouldn't it make more sense to work with tenants who are clearly invested in the property?" I considered this question carefully. It was exactly the kind of reasoning that had allowed Jennifer and Derek to justify their behavior, and that had led to their dismissive comments about elderly property owners who didn't understand modern tenant expectations. "You're suggesting that I should overlook lease violations because the tenants claim their violations were improvements?" "I'm suggesting that maybe there's room for flexibility when the tenants are clearly acting in good faith," Marcus replied. "Good faith." I repeated the phrase slowly. "Is it good faith when tenants install unauthorized modifications and then demand rent reductions? Is it good faith when they complain about property values declining while simultaneously looking for investment properties in the same neighborhood? Is it good faith when they publicly criticize their landlord's competence while privately benefiting from her reasonable rent prices?" Both Marcus and Sabrina looked confused by my detailed knowledge of the situation, but I wasn't finished. "I had an interesting conversation with my property manager this week," I continued. "Apparently, the Walsh family has been quite difficult to work with lately. They've made demands for property improvements while complaining about rent increases that are well below market rates. They've also been telling people that they're looking for other housing options, despite the fact that they can't find anything comparable in their price range." The color drained from Sabrina's face as she realized how much I knew about her friend's situation. "Rose, I'm sure they didn't mean any disrespect. Sometimes people just get frustrated when they feel like they're not being heard." "Oh, I heard them quite clearly," I said, shouldering my old leather purse. "In fact, I found their opinions about elderly property owners quite enlightening." I walked to the door, then turned back to face them both. "I'll be making some decisions about my properties over the next few weeks. I thought you should know, since you seem to have such strong opinions about how elderly property owners should manage their assets." The drive home gave me time to process the evening's revelations. For years, I'd allowed Marcus and Sabrina to treat me as if I were a burden they needed to manage, a problem they needed to solve. Their concern for my welfare had always felt conditional, contingent on my willingness to conform to their vision of appropriate behavior for someone my age. Now they knew the truth about my financial situation, but I suspected their reaction would be predictable. Instead of respecting my choices about how to live my life, they would simply shift their focus to how I should manage my wealth. The conversation would change from "Mom needs help with her old house" to "Mom needs help with her investment portfolio." The following morning, I called Sandra Hartwell to schedule another meeting. This time I had specific questions about my options as a property owner, particularly regarding difficult tenants and lease enforcement. "Rose, I have to say, you've got me curious," Sandra said when we met in her office that afternoon. "Yesterday, you seemed interested in taking a more active role in tenant relations. Today, you're asking about eviction procedures and lease termination options. Is everything all right?" I settled into the familiar chair across from her desk and opened my notebook. Over the past 24 hours, I'd made several decisions about my future and the future of my tenants. "Sandra, I've learned some interesting things about how my tenants view their relationship with their landlord. I think it's time to clarify a few misunderstandings." I told her about the coffee shop conversation, about Jennifer Walsh's comments regarding elderly property owners, and about the dinner table discussion where my own family had echoed those sentiments without knowing I was listening to criticisms of my own management style. Sandra's expression grew increasingly incredulous as I described the various opinions I'd encountered about my competence, my investment strategies, and my obligation to accommodate tenant demands for unauthorized property modifications. "Wait," she interrupted. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. Jennifer Walsh, who lives in your Maple Ridge property, Was complaining to you about her own landlord without realizing you were her landlord? That's correct. And she specifically mentioned that elderly property owners should be forced to sell if they're not using their properties productively. Sandra stared at me for a long moment, then began to laugh. Rose, this is like something out of a television comedy. Did you tell her who you were? Not yet, but I'm planning to have that conversation very soon. We spent the next hour reviewing my options. As Sandra explained it, I had considerable leverage as a property owner, particularly with tenants who had violated their lease terms. The unauthorized hot tub installation alone was grounds for immediate lease termination, regardless of whether the tenants considered it an improvement. However, Sandra cautioned, eviction proceedings can be time-consuming and expensive. If your goal is simply to assert your authority as the property owner, there might be more effective approaches. What did you have in mind? Sandra pulled out the Walsh family's lease agreement and flipped to the section dealing with property modifications. Well, according to their lease terms, any unauthorized changes to the property must be removed at the tenant's expense upon lease termination or renewal. That includes the hot tub, the lighting fixtures, and the carpet replacement they mentioned. I studied the relevant clauses, noting the specific language that Frank's lawyer had recommended when we first started renting properties. Frank had been thorough about protecting our interests while remaining fair to responsible tenants. What would happen if I chose not to renew their lease when it expires next spring? They would have 30 days to find alternative housing and remove any unauthorized modifications. If they failed to remove the modifications, you could have them removed professionally and charge the cost to their security deposit. And if the cost exceeded their security deposit, you could pursue them for the additional amount through small claims court. I made notes in my notebook, calculating timelines and considering options. The Walsh family's lease would expire in 6 months, which gave me time to observe their behavior and determine whether they were capable of learning respect for property ownership rights. Sandra, I'd like to schedule personal meetings with each of my tenants over the next month. I think it's time they met their landlord face to face. Sandra's eyebrows rose. All of them? That's unusual, Rose. Most property owners prefer to maintain some distance from their tenants to avoid getting drawn into personal conflicts. I'm not most property owners, I replied, and I think personal relationships might be exactly what some of my tenants need to understand their responsibilities. We scheduled the tenant meetings for the following 2 weeks, starting with the most problematic cases and working toward the more stable rental relationships. I left Sandra's office with a clear plan and a renewed sense of purpose. That evening, I called Eleanor to share the day's developments. Her reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Rose, this is perfect. You've got them completely off balance, and they don't even know it yet. I can't wait to hear how this plays out. I'm not trying to be vindictive, I explained. I just want them to understand that respect works both ways in landlord-tenant relationships. Honey, wanting respect isn't vindictive. It's basic human dignity. The fact that you've had to fight for it at your age is the real tragedy here. Eleanor's words stayed with me as I prepared for the first tenant meeting, scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the Maple Ridge property. I'd asked Sandra to arrange it as a routine landlord introduction, without revealing any of the background circumstances that had prompted my decision to meet the tenants personally. Thursday arrived with unseasonably warm weather for late October. I dressed carefully in a simple gray dress and blazer. Professional but not intimidating. My hair was pulled back in its usual style, and I carried the same leather purse that had caused so much amusement at the coffee shop. The Maple Ridge development was a testament to careful urban planning, with tree-lined streets and well-maintained common areas. The houses were substantial without being ostentatious, designed for families who valued quality over flashiness. Property values had indeed appreciated significantly over the years, just as Frank had predicted when we'd purchased our first rental house here in 1978. 1247 Maple Ridge Lane was a 3-bedroom colonial with dark blue shutters and a small front porch. The lawn was neatly maintained, and someone had planted mums along the front walkway in preparation for fall. As I walked up the front steps, I could see the unauthorized hot tub on the back deck through the side yard. Jennifer answered the door wearing yoga pants and an expensive-looking sweater. her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that probably took 20 minutes to achieve the perfect level of effortless chic. Her expression was politely curious rather than concerned, suggesting that Sandra had successfully framed the meeting as a routine introduction. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Jennifer Walsh. Please come in." The interior of the house had been significantly modified from its original state. The living room walls had been painted in trendy gray tones, and several light fixtures had been replaced with modern alternatives that looked expensive but clashed with the house's traditional architecture. New hardwood floors gleamed throughout the main level, replacing the original carpeting that had been in excellent condition when the Walshes moved in. Derek emerged from what I remembered as the dining room but which now appeared to be a home office. He was a tall, athletically built man in his mid-30s, with the kind of confident handshake that suggested success in sales or business development. "Great to finally meet you, Mrs. Henderson. We've been renting this place for, 3 years now? It's about time we got to put a face with the name." "Actually," I said, settling into the chair they offered, "I'm afraid there might be some confusion about exactly who I am." Jennifer poured coffee from an expensive-looking machine that definitely hadn't been part of the original kitchen appliances. "Oh, are you not with the property management company?" "I am the property owner," I said simply. "This is my house." The silence that followed was profound. Derek set down his coffee cup with enough force to make the saucer rattle, while Jennifer stared at me as if I'd announced I was from another planet. "You're the owner?" Derek's voice had lost its confident tone. "But I thought—" Sandra always said the owner was an elderly woman who preferred to remain anonymous. "I am an elderly woman who preferred to remain anonymous," I replied. "Until recently." Jennifer's face had gone pale, and I could see her mind racing through the implications of my presence in her living room. "Mrs. Henderson, if this is about the improvements we've made, we can explain everything. We've actually increased the property value significantly." "Have you?" "Oh yes," Derek said, his sales training kicking in as he began what was clearly a prepared presentation. "The hardwood floors alone added at least $15,000 to the market value. The updated lighting fixtures, the fresh paint, the landscaping improvements. We've probably put $25,000 worth of value-added improvements into this property." "Improvements that you made without permission," I pointed out. "Well, yes, technically," Jennifer said, her voice taking on a defensive tone. "But we figured you'd be grateful for the upgrades once you saw how much they enhanced the property." I opened my notebook and consulted the lease agreement that Sandra had provided. "According to your lease terms, any modifications to the property must be approved in writing by the property owner before work begins. Did you request approval for any of these changes?" Derek and Jennifer exchanged glances, clearly realizing that their assumed gratitude defense wasn't working as planned. "We mentioned some of our plans to Sandra," Derek said. "We thought she would pass along our ideas to the owner. Sandra told me that you demanded granite countertops and became upset when she explained that cosmetic upgrades weren't typically provided by landlords." Jennifer's cheeks reddened. "We didn't demand anything. We simply suggested that updating the kitchen would be a smart investment for the property. After you'd already installed hardwood floors throughout the house without permission." "Mrs. Henderson," Derek said, his voice taking on the patient tone that Marcus had used with me at dinner, "I think there might be some misunderstanding here. We're excellent tenants. We pay our rent on time, we take outstanding care of the property, and we've made improvements that benefit everyone. Surely you can see that we're the kind of tenants any landlord would want to keep." I studied them both for a moment, these confident young people who were so certain of their value and so dismissive of property ownership rights when those rights belonged to someone they considered irrelevant. "Tell me about your search for investment properties," I said. The non sequitur caught them off guard, and Jennifer actually flinched as if I'd struck her. "Our what?" "Your search for investment properties. I understand you've been looking for rental properties to purchase in neighborhoods like this one." Derek's expression grew wary. "We've been exploring some investment opportunities, yes. But I'm not sure what that has to do with our lease situation. I'm curious about your criteria for good investment properties. What do you look for when you're evaluating potential purchases?" Jennifer seemed to sense that this conversation was heading somewhere dangerous, but Derek's sales instincts led him directly into the trap. Well, location is everything, of course. Good neighborhoods, appreciation potential, the kind of properties that attract quality tenants who take care of things and don't cause problems. And what about the sellers? Do you have preferences about who you'd like to buy from? Motivated sellers, obviously, Derek replied, gaining confidence as he moved into familiar territory. People who understand market dynamics and are willing to negotiate reasonable terms. What about elderly sellers? I understand they can sometimes be difficult to work with. Jennifer shot her husband a warning look, but Derek was already committed to the conversation. Sometimes, yes. Older property owners don't always understand current market conditions. They can be resistant to reasonable offers, or they have unrealistic ideas about what their properties are worth. Unrealistic in what way? They might be emotionally attached to properties that are just investments, Derek explained. Or they might not understand that holding on to real estate without maximizing its potential is essentially leaving money on the table. I nodded thoughtfully. So you believe that elderly property owners have an obligation to sell to younger buyers who would use the properties more productively? I wouldn't put it quite that way, Derek said, though his tone suggested he would put it exactly that way under different circumstances. I just think everyone benefits when properties are in the hands of people who understand their potential. Jennifer was staring at her husband with barely concealed horror, apparently realizing that he was digging them into a deeper hole with every word. Derek, she said quietly, maybe we should focus on our current situation rather than hypothetical property investments. But I wasn't ready to let the topic go. I find your perspective interesting, Derek. Do you think your current landlord understands the potential of this property? Derek glanced around the room, taking in the unauthorized improvements they'd made. Honestly, probably not. This property has incredible potential, but it needs someone who's willing to invest in updates and improvements. The owner seems content to just collect rent without putting any money back into the property. What kind of improvements do you think the property needs? Jennifer tried to intervene again. Mrs. Henderson, I think what Derek is trying to say is that we've been happy to contribute to the property's upkeep because we appreciate living here. Actually, I'm interested in Derek's opinion about what the property needs. Derek, oblivious to his wife's desperate signals, launched into a detailed critique of my property management strategy. The kitchen appliances are outdated, the bathrooms could use modernizing, the deck needs to be expanded to accommodate entertaining, and honestly, the whole house could benefit from a more open floor plan. How much do you estimate these improvements would cost? Probably $60,000 to $80,000 for a complete renovation, Derek said. But the increased property value and rental income potential would easily justify the investment. I made notes in my notebook, watching Jennifer grow more agitated with each item her husband added to his renovation wish list. And you believe the current owner should make these investments? If she wants to maximize the property's potential, absolutely. Otherwise, she should consider selling to someone who will. Someone like you? Derek's confidence faltered slightly. Well, we'd certainly be interested in purchasing the property if the owner was motivated to sell. At what price? Fair market value, of course. Probably somewhere in the $400 to $450 range, depending on condition and comparable sales. I consulted my notebook again, where I'd written the most recent property assessment that Sandra had provided. According to current market analysis, 1247 Maple Ridge Lane was worth approximately $520,000. That's interesting, I said. What makes you think $450 would be fair market value? Derek's sales training kicked in again. Well, you have to factor in the condition of the property, the needed improvements, and the current market dynamics. A cash offer from serious buyers who are already familiar with the property would be worth accepting even at a slight discount. Jennifer looked like she wanted to disappear into the furniture. Derek, maybe we should ask Mrs. Henderson if she has any specific concerns about our tenancy that we should address. Actually, I do have some concerns, I said. But first I'm curious about something else. Have either of you had conversations with other people about elderly property owners and their management capabilities? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Jennifer's face went completely white, while Derek looked confused by the apparent change of subject. I'm not sure what you mean, Jennifer said carefully. I mean conversations where you might have expressed opinions about elderly landlords who don't understand market forces or tenant expectations. Jennifer's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound. Derek looked back and forth between us, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, but unable to grasp exactly what. "Mrs. Henderson," Jennifer finally managed, "if someone told you that we criticized our landlord, I can assure you it was taken out of context. Was it taken out of context when you said that elderly property owners should be forced to sell if they're not using their properties productively?" The direct quote hit Jennifer like a physical blow. She actually gasped and gripped the arm of her chair as if the room were spinning. Derek stared at his wife. "Jennifer, what is she talking about?" "I think Jennifer knows exactly what I'm talking about," I said calmly. "Would you like to explain to your husband what you said about your landlord at the PTA meeting last week?" Jennifer's voice came out as barely a whisper. "You were there." "I was there, listening to you complain about the old woman who owns this house, listening to you explain why she should be forced to sell, listening to your friends agree that elderly property owners are obstacles to younger families who deserve better housing opportunities." Derek's face went through several shades of red as he began to understand the situation. "Jennifer, you were talking about our landlord? In public?" "I didn't know she was there," Jennifer said defensively. "And I didn't say anything that wasn't true. This property does have potential that isn't being realized." "You said I was incompetent," I corrected. "You said I was selfishly hoarding prime real estate while young families struggled to find decent housing. You said I should be forced to sell because I don't understand how to manage property properly." The silence that followed was deafening. Derek stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, while Jennifer seemed to be calculating how much damage control might be possible. "Mrs. Henderson," Derek said finally, "I had no idea Jennifer had said those things. I want to apologize on behalf of both of us. Do you agree with her assessment?" Derek hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to his wife and his growing realization that their housing situation had just become very precarious. "I think there might have been some misunderstandings," he said carefully. "What kind of misunderstandings?" "Well, we've always assumed that our landlord would appreciate tenants who take initiative and make improvements to the property. We thought our renovations demonstrated our commitment to maintaining and enhancing the property value." "Your unauthorized renovations," I clarified. "Yes, but renovations that added value," Derek insisted. "Surely you can see that we've been good tenants who deserve some consideration for our investments in the property." I opened my notebook and turned to a page where I'd calculated some figures with Sandra's help. "Let's talk about investments, Derek. You mentioned that you've put about $25,000 worth of improvements into this property." "At least that much," Derek agreed, seeming encouraged by what he perceived as a more business-like direction for the conversation. "And you believe these improvements give you some claim to consideration from the property owner." "I wouldn't call it a claim, exactly, but I do think they demonstrate our value as tenants." I consulted my notes. "According to my calculations, you've paid approximately $63,000 in rent over the past 3 years. The market value of this property has appreciated by roughly $80,000 during that same period, which means your rent has been significantly below market rates." Derek looked confused. "I'm not sure I follow. You've been living in a property worth over $500,000 for about $1,700 a month. Comparable properties in this neighborhood are currently renting for $2,500 to $2,800 per month." The numbers hit them both like a cold splash of water. Jennifer actually did some quick mental math and came up with a figure that made her eyes widen. "You're saying we've been getting a deal on rent?" Derek asked. "I'm saying you've been living in a premium property at below market rates while complaining that your landlord doesn't understand property values." Derek and Jennifer exchanged glances, both apparently realizing that their position in this conversation was much weaker than they'd initially assumed. "We didn't realize," Jennifer said quietly. "You didn't realize because you never bothered to research comparable rental rates in this neighborhood. You assumed that because I'm elderly, I must be out of touch with market conditions." "That's not what we assumed," Derek protested. though his tone suggested otherwise. Isn't it? You told me just a few minutes ago that elderly property owners don't understand current market conditions and have unrealistic ideas about property values. Were you talking about someone else? Derek's face reddened again. Mrs. Henderson, I think we got off on the wrong foot here. I think we got off on exactly the foot your wife established when she decided to publicly criticize my competence and character without knowing who I am. Jennifer finally found her voice. I apologize for those comments. They were inappropriate and unfair. Were they inaccurate as well? Jennifer hesitated, clearly trying to determine what answer would be most helpful to her situation. I think I may have misjudged the situation. What situation did you misjudge? I assumed that you weren't actively managing the property or making strategic decisions about its use. Based on what evidence? Jennifer struggled for an answer. Based on the fact that you haven't made major improvements or updates to the property. And you concluded from this that I was incompetent rather than satisfied with the property's current condition and rental income. I suppose I did, Jennifer admitted. I turned to Derek. What about you? Do you still believe this property needs $60,000 to $80,000 in renovations to reach its potential? Derek looked around the room, apparently seeing it with new eyes now that he understood the true market dynamics of their rental situation. Maybe not, he said slowly. If the property is already generating appropriate rental income at current market rates, then major renovations might not be necessary. And do you still believe I should sell the property to someone who would use it more productively? Derek's silence was answer enough. I closed my notebook and prepared to leave. I want you both to think very carefully about our conversation tonight. You've been living in a valuable property at below-market rent rates, while publicly criticizing your landlord's competence and privately planning to pressure her into selling the property to you at below-market prices. Jennifer looked stricken. Mrs. Henderson, we never intended to pressure you into anything. You installed $25,000 worth of unauthorized modifications to my property without permission, then told people I should be grateful for your improvements. You complained about rental rates while paying significantly less than market value. You criticized my property management skills while benefiting from my decision to keep rents affordable. What would you call that if not pressure? Neither of them had an answer. I stood up and walked toward the door. Your lease expires in 6 months. I suggest you use that time to decide whether you want to be the kind of tenants that a landlord chooses to keep. What does that mean? Derek asked. It means you have 6 months to demonstrate that you understand the difference between being good tenants and being entitled tenants. And if we don't meet your expectations? Jennifer's voice was barely audible. Then you'll need to find somewhere else to live. And you'll need to remove all unauthorized modifications to the property at your own expense before you leave. I let that sink in for a moment. I'll be in touch through Sandra regarding expectations for the remainder of your lease term. Good evening. I drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because I'd finally stood up for myself and established clear boundaries with tenants who had taken advantage of my passive management style. Sadness because the confrontation had been necessary in the first place. The next morning brought a phone call from Sandra, who sounded both amused and concerned. Rose, I got a very interesting call from the Walsh family this morning. They wanted to know if there was anything they could do to ensure lease renewal, and they seemed particularly concerned about the unauthorized modifications to the property. I imagine they were. They also asked about current market rental rates for comparable properties in Maple Ridge. Apparently, they'd never researched what similar houses were renting for. Did you provide that information? I did. Jennifer Walsh nearly fainted when I told her what her neighbors are paying for similar properties. She kept asking if I was sure about the figures. I wasn't surprised. The cognitive dissonance between their complaints about rental costs and the reality of their below-market housing situation must have been considerable. Sandra, I want to schedule meetings with my other tenants over the next 2 weeks. I think it's time I introduced myself to everyone. All of them? Rose, that's going to be quite an undertaking. Are you sure you want to get that involved in tenant relations? I'm sure. After last night, I realize I've been too hands-off as a property owner. It's time my tenants understood that their landlord is a real person with expectations and standards. We scheduled meetings with the remaining 6 tenant families, spacing them out over the following 2 weeks to give me time to process each conversation and adjust my approach as needed. The second meeting was with the Morrison family, who rented a 2-bedroom townhouse in Oakwood Commons. Unlike the Walshes, the Morrisons had been model tenants for 4 years, paying rent promptly and maintaining their property in excellent condition. I was curious to meet them and understand how they viewed the landlord-tenant relationship. Oakwood Commons was a newer development than Maple Ridge, built in the early 1990s with an emphasis on community amenities and shared green spaces. The townhouses were designed for young families and empty nesters who wanted low-maintenance living without sacrificing privacy or comfort. The Morrison home was immaculate, with a small but well-tended garden and a front porch decorated with seasonal flowers. When Linda Morrison answered the door, her smile was genuine and welcoming, rather than nervous or calculating. "Mrs. Henderson, what a wonderful surprise! We've been hoping to meet you for years." Linda was a woman in her mid-40s with graying hair and laugh lines that suggested someone who found joy in everyday moments. Her husband Tom appeared from the families who treated me with respect and maintained their properties carefully were also the families who paid rent promptly and never made unreasonable demands. The families who viewed me as an obstacle to be managed or manipulated were invariably the ones who caused problems for Sandra and who seemed to believe that rental housing was something they deserved, rather than something they were privileged to access. The most interesting meeting was with the Patterson family, who rented a 3-bedroom house in Riverside Gardens. Similar to the Walshes, they had made unauthorized modifications to their property, but their approach to discussing these changes was completely different. "Mrs. Henderson," Carol Patterson said as she showed me through their home, "we hope you don't mind, but we've made a few small improvements to the house over the past 2 years. We kept all the receipts and took photos of the original condition so we could restore everything if needed." The changes they'd made were modest but thoughtful. Updated cabinet hardware in the kitchen, new bathroom fixtures, and fresh paint in colors that complemented the house's original design. Everything had been done professionally, and the improvements genuinely enhanced the property's appeal without altering its fundamental character. "We wanted to run these changes by you first," her husband Mark explained, "but Sandra said you preferred minimal contact with tenants. We decided to proceed but document everything carefully in case you objected." "Why did you feel these improvements were necessary?" I asked. Carol and Mark looked at each other, apparently surprised by the question. "We didn't feel they were necessary," Carol said. "We wanted to make small changes that would help the house feel more like our home while we're living here. But we made sure everything could be easily reversed if you preferred the original finishes." "And you kept receipts and photos?" "Of course," Mark said, producing a neat folder of documentation. "These are your property, Mrs. Henderson. We're just temporary stewards." Temporary stewards. The phrase encapsulated an attitude that was completely different from the Walshes' assumption that their tenancy gave them ownership rights. When I complimented the quality of their improvements, Carol smiled. "Mark's a contractor, so he knows how to do things properly. We figured if we were going to make changes, we should do them right." "Have you considered purchasing a home of your own?" "We've thought about it," Mark replied. "But honestly, renting from you has been such a positive experience that we're in no hurry to leave. You charge fair rent, the property is well maintained, and Sandra is excellent to work with. Why would we want to complicate our lives with mortgage payments and property taxes when we're so comfortable here?" It was a refreshing perspective from tenants who understood the value of good rental housing and didn't view homeownership as the only acceptable endpoint for their housing journey. By the end of the 2 weeks, I had a clear picture of my tenant relationships and a better understanding of which families deserved continued access to below-market housing. The Morrison and Patterson families, along with 2 others, had earned lease renewals through their respectful behavior and careful property maintenance. One family had been adequate but unremarkable and would receive a lease renewal with rental rates adjusted to current market levels. That left the Walsh family, whose behavior had catalyzed my decision to take a more active role in property management. 3 weeks had passed since my confrontation with Derek and Jennifer, and according to Sandra, they had been model tenants during that period. They'd contacted her to request approval for any future modifications, they'd paid their rent early, and they'd even sent flowers with a note apologizing for any misunderstandings. But I wasn't interested in temporary good behavior motivated by fear. I was interested in genuine understanding and lasting respect for property ownership rights. On a cold December morning, I called Sandra to discuss my decision about the Walsh family's lease renewal. "Rose, I have to say, they've been trying very hard to make amends," Sandra reported. "Jennifer called yesterday to ask if there were any specific kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel and extending a warm handshake. "Please, come in," Tom said. "We were just finishing dinner cleanup, but we've got coffee made if you'd like some." The interior of their townhouse was comfortable without being pretentious, decorated with family photos and children's artwork that spoke of a life focused on relationships rather than status. The original fixtures and finishes were in perfect condition, and I could see evidence of careful maintenance throughout the home. "We owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude," Linda said as we settled in their living room. "This house has been such a blessing for our family." "How so?" Tom leaned forward, his expression earnest. "When we moved here 4 years ago, we'd been struggling to find decent housing that we could afford on our income. I'm a teacher and Linda works part-time as a nurse, so we don't have the kind of salaries that qualify for most of the nice properties in good school districts. The rent you charge is so reasonable compared to what other landlords are asking," Linda added. "It's allowed us to save money for our children's college funds instead of spending everything on housing costs." I was struck by the contrast between their gratitude and the Walshes' sense of entitlement. Both families were benefiting from below-market rental rates, but their responses to that benefit were completely different. "Have you been happy with the property management arrangement?" I asked. "Sandra has been wonderful," Tom replied immediately. "Anytime we've had maintenance issues, she's responded quickly and professionally. Last winter, when our furnace started making strange noises, she had a technician here within 2 hours. We've tried to take excellent care of the property," Linda said. "We know how fortunate we are to live here, and we want to be the kind of tenants you'd want to keep." "What does that mean to you, being the kind of tenants I'd want to keep?" Linda and Tom exchanged glances, apparently surprised by the question. "Well," Linda said thoughtfully, "I suppose it means paying rent on time, taking care of the property as if it were our own home, and being respectful of your investment." "Your investment?" I repeated. "This house represents a significant financial commitment on your part," Tom explained. "You could probably sell it tomorrow and make a substantial profit, but instead you're allowing our family to live here at affordable rates. We don't take that lightly." The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from their children's activities to their long-term housing plans. What struck me most was their awareness that they were participants in a mutually beneficial arrangement, rather than entitled recipients of housing services. When I mentioned that I owned several other properties in the area, neither Linda nor Tom expressed surprise or suddenly became interested in investment advice or purchasing opportunities. They simply thanked me again for providing them with a stable, affordable home. "Mrs. Henderson," Linda said as I prepared to leave, "is there anything we should be doing differently as tenants? Any concerns you'd like us to address?" The question caught me off guard. In 4 years of renting to the Morrison family, they'd never given me any cause for concern, yet they were actively seeking feedback about their performance as tenants. "You've been exemplary tenants," I told them honestly. "I hope you'll consider staying for many more years." The relief on their faces was immediate and touching. "We'd love to stay," Tom said. "Our kids are settled in school, we've made wonderful friends in the neighborhood, and this house truly feels like home to us. Then we'll plan on renewing your lease when it comes up for review." I left the Morrison home feeling uplifted and reminded that good landlord-tenant relationships were not only possible but deeply rewarding for everyone involved. The contrast between my 2 tenant meetings couldn't have been more stark. The Walshes had approached our relationship as adversaries, looking for ways to extract maximum value while giving minimum respect. The Morrisons had approached it as partners, recognizing that their landlord's success contributed to their own housing stability. Over the next 2 weeks, I met with the remaining 5 tenant families, and the pattern that emerged was illuminating. The improvements or maintenance issues you'd like them to address before lease renewal time. "What did you tell her?" I told her that property maintenance was primarily the landlord's responsibility, and that tenants should focus on taking good care of what's already there rather than trying to make unsolicited improvements. How did she respond to that? Sandra chuckled. She seemed confused by the concept that tenants aren't supposed to renovate rental properties without permission. I think she's been operating under some very different assumptions about renters' rights. Sandra, I've made my decision about their lease renewal. And? I won't be renewing their lease. They'll have until March to find alternative housing and remove all unauthorized modifications. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Rose, are you sure about this? They really have been trying to make things right. They've been trying to avoid consequences for their behavior. That's different from actually understanding what they did wrong. May I ask what convinced you to take this step? I thought about Jennifer Walsh's voice in the coffee shop. Dismissive and cruel in its casual assumption that elderly people were obstacles to be removed. I thought about Jennifer Walsh's voice in the coffee shop. Dismissive and cruel in its casual assumption that elderly people were obstacles to be removed rather than individuals deserving of respect. Sandra? They spent 3 years taking advantage of below-market rent while publicly criticizing my competence. Their recent good behavior is damage control, not genuine change in attitude. I understand your position, Sandra said carefully. Should I handle the non-renewal notification, or would you prefer to deliver it personally? The question made me pause. Part of me wanted to confront them directly, to see their faces when they realized the full consequences of their disrespect. But another part of me recognized that such a confrontation would be more about my satisfaction than about effective property management. You handle the official notification, I decided, but I want to be present when they receive it. I think they deserve to understand exactly why this decision was made. We scheduled the meeting for the following Thursday afternoon. I spent the intervening days thinking about what I wanted to say and how I wanted to handle what would likely be an emotional conversation. On Thursday morning, Eleanor called to check on my progress with the tenant situations. Rose, you've been busier than a diplomat during wartime, she said. How are your property management adventures going? I filled her in on the various tenant meetings and my decision about the Walsh family. Her reaction was immediate approval. Good for you. Those people needed to learn that actions have consequences. Too many young folks today think they can treat others badly and then apologize their way out of trouble when it becomes inconvenient. I hope I'm doing the right thing, I said. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being too harsh. Honey, you gave them 3 years of below-market rent, and they repaid you with public mockery. If anything, you're being too generous by giving them until March to move out. Eleanor's support was reassuring, but I still felt nervous as I drove to the Maple Ridge property that afternoon. Sandra was already there when I arrived, sitting in her car and reviewing paperwork. Rose, are you ready for this? She asked as we walked up to the front door. I have to warn you, Jennifer sounded quite upset when I called to schedule this meeting. I think she knows what's coming. Derek answered the door this time, his expression grim but controlled. Mrs. Henderson, Sandra, please come in. Jennifer's in the living room. Jennifer was perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her usual polished appearance had been replaced by an anxious dishevelment that suggested she'd been losing sleep over the past few days. Mrs. Henderson, she said immediately. Before you say anything, Derek and I want you to know how much we've appreciated living here. This house has been such a blessing for our family. The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. 3 weeks earlier, this same woman had been complaining about my competence and suggesting I should be forced to sell the property. Now it was suddenly a blessing. Sandra took charge of the formal proceedings. I've asked Mrs. Henderson to join me today because we have some important information to share about your lease renewal. Derek's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Jennifer looked back and forth between Sandra and me, her face pale with anticipation. After careful consideration, Sandra continued, Mrs. Henderson has decided not to renew your lease when it expires in March. You'll have until March 15th to vacate the property. The silence that followed was profound. Jennifer actually gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she'd been physically struck. Not renew? Derek's voice was hoarse. But we've been model tenants. We've done everything right. For the past 3 weeks, I said quietly. After 3 years of taking advantage of below-market rent, while publicly criticizing my competence as a property owner. Jennifer's face crumpled. Mrs. Henderson, I've apologized for those comments. I was wrong, and I know that now. You were wrong about my competence. I agreed. But you were also wrong about something much more fundamental. You were wrong about basic respect for other human beings. Derek leaned forward, his expression desperate. What can we do to change your mind? We're willing to do anything. Are you willing to pay market rent for the property? Derek and Jennifer exchanged glances. What would market rent be? Approximately $2,800 per month. The number hit them like a physical blow. They'd been paying $1,700, and the additional $1,100 per month would represent a significant strain on their budget. We could probably manage that, Derek said uncertainly. It would be tight, but we could make it work. I shook my head. Derek, I'm not interested in punishing you financially. I'm interested in finding tenants who understand the difference between privilege and entitlement. We understand that difference now, Jennifer said, her voice breaking slightly. Please, Mrs. Henderson, give us another chance. Do you understand it? I asked. Or do you understand that disrespecting your landlord has consequences? Jennifer struggled for an answer. I understand that I was wrong to criticize you publicly. I understand that you've been more than fair with our rent, and I took that for granted. What else do you understand? I understand that making unauthorized changes to your property was inappropriate. What else? Jennifer looked confused by the continuing questions. I'm not sure what else you want me to say. I want you to understand that elderly people deserve the same respect as anyone else. I want you to understand that dismissing someone based on their age or appearance is both cruel and foolish. I want you to understand that your financial struggles don't give you the right to demean other people. Derek tried to intervene. Mrs. Henderson, Jennifer has learned her lesson. We both have. Have you, Derek? 3 weeks ago, you told me that elderly property owners don't understand market dynamics and should sell to younger buyers who would use properties more productively. Do you still believe that? Derek's face reddened. I think I was speaking generally about market forces, not about you specifically. You were speaking about me very specifically, Derek. I was sitting in your living room listening to you explain why I should sell this house to someone like you. I didn't know you were the owner then, Derek protested. Does that make your comments less offensive or more offensive? Derek had no answer for that. I turned back to Jennifer. At the coffee shop, you said elderly property owners should be forced to sell if they're not using their properties productively. What did you mean by that? Jennifer's voice was barely audible. I thought you weren't maintaining the property properly or charging appropriate rent. Based on what evidence? Based on the fact that you hadn't made major improvements or updates. Did it occur to you that I might be satisfied with the property's condition and rental income? No, Jennifer admitted. I assumed you didn't understand the property's potential. Because I'm elderly. Jennifer nodded reluctantly. And you thought that gave you the right to criticize my competence in public. I was wrong, Jennifer whispered. I stood up, signaling that the conversation was coming to an end. Yes, you were wrong, but more than that, you were cruel. You reduced a human being you'd never met to a stereotype based on age, and you used that stereotype to justify dismissing her worth and capabilities. I never meant to be cruel, Jennifer said, tears beginning to flow. I was just frustrated about our housing situation. Your frustration about living in below-market housing while complaining about the person who made that possible. Derek tried one more approach. Mrs. Henderson, what if we signed a longer lease? 2 years, 3 years, whatever you want. We're committed to being the kind of tenants you want to keep. Derek, the kind of tenants I want to keep wouldn't have needed this conversation in the first place. Sandra gathered up her paperwork, preparing to leave. You'll receive the formal notice in the mail within the next few days. It will include information about security deposit return and requirements for removing unauthorized modifications. Jennifer looked up sharply. We have to remove the improvements we made? Unauthorized modifications must be removed at tenant expense, Sandra confirmed. That's standard lease language. But we spent $25,000 on those improvements, Derek protested. You spent $25,000 on unauthorized modifications to someone else's property, I corrected. That was your choice, but it was also your financial risk. The full implications of their situation were beginning to sink in. Not only would they need to find new housing in a tight rental market, but they'd also need to pay for professional removal of their improvements before they could recover their security deposit. "Mrs. Henderson," Jennifer said desperately, "please reconsider. We have children to think about. Moving will disrupt their school year, their friendships. This is their home." The appeal to my sympathy was calculated, but not entirely insincere. I felt genuinely sorry for the children who would be affected by their parents' poor judgment. "Jennifer, your children's stability is your responsibility, not mine. You had 3 years to build a positive relationship with your landlord. Instead, you chose to take advantage of my generosity while mocking my competence." "We didn't know," Derek said weakly. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You made assumptions based on prejudice and acted on those assumptions without considering that you might be wrong." I walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. "Derek, Jennifer, I want you to think about something as you're looking for new housing. You'll be dealing with landlords who may be young or old, experienced or new to property management, generous or strictly business-oriented. I suggest you approach those relationships with more respect than you showed me." We left them sitting in their living room, surrounded by the unauthorized improvements they'd thought would demonstrate their value as tenants. As we walked to our cars, Sandra shook her head. "Rose, I have to admit, part of me feels sorry for them. They really seem to have learned their lesson." "They learned that disrespecting their landlord has consequences," I replied. "That's not the same as learning respect for other people. Do you think you'll have trouble finding new tenants for the property?" I smiled. "Sandra, we'll have a dozen applications within a week of listing it. Good rental properties in desirable neighborhoods don't stay vacant long. And you're not worried about the rental income during the transition? I've been earning below-market rent from the Walshes for 3 years. A month or two of vacancy while we find respectful tenants will be worth the long-term benefit of better tenant relations." 2 weeks later, Sandra called with an update on the Walsh situation. "Rose, you're not going to believe this. Derek Walsh called yesterday to ask if you'd be willing to sell them the property instead of evicting them." I nearly dropped the phone. "He wants to buy it?" Apparently, they've been pre-approved for a mortgage and they think purchasing the house would solve their housing problem. "At what price?" "He offered $450,000, the same figure he mentioned when you met with them." I thought about Derek's confident assertion that $450,000 would be fair market value for a property currently worth over $500,000. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd pass along the offer but that I doubted you'd be interested in selling." "You're right. I'm not interested. May I ask why?" "It would certainly solve the tenant problem, and the offer isn't completely unreasonable." "Sandra, the offer is $70,000 below current market value from people who spent 3 years disrespecting me and are now trying to pressure me into a below-market sale to solve their housing crisis. When you put it that way, it does seem rather presumptuous." "It's more than presumptuous. It's exactly the kind of behavior that led to my decision not to renew their lease." The final chapter of the Walsh family saga came in February, when Sandra called to report that they'd found alternative housing. "They're moving to a rental property in Westbrook Heights," she told me. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, similar to what they have now. "What's the rent?" $3,200 a month. I calculated quickly. The Walshes would be paying nearly double what they'd been paying me for comparable housing in a less desirable neighborhood, and they're handling the modification removal? They've hired contractors to restore the property to its original condition. The work should be completed before they move out. "Any problems with the process?" Sandra chuckled. "Jennifer called me crying yesterday. Apparently, the cost of removing their improvements is going to be about $15,000. The flooring removal alone is $8,000 because they have to refinish the original hardwood underneath." "Are they going to complete the work?" "They have to if they want their security deposit back. And frankly, I think they've realized that fighting you would be more expensive than complying." The property was relisted in March at market rent rates, and we received 17 applications within the first week. Sandra and I interviewed the top candidates, looking for tenants who understood the value of stable housing and the importance of maintaining positive relationships with their landlord. We ultimately selected the Martinez family: Carlos, a high school math teacher, his wife Elena, a registered nurse, and their 2 teenage children. Their rental history was spotless, Their references were enthusiastic, and most importantly, they approached the landlord-tenant relationship with respect and appreciation rather than entitlement and demands. Mrs. Henderson, Elena said when we completed the lease signing, "We want you to know how grateful we are for this opportunity. We've been looking for a rental in a good neighborhood for months, and most landlords won't even consider families with teenagers." "Why is that?" I asked. Carlos answered. "Some people assume that teenagers will damage property or cause problems with neighbors. We understand those concerns, but we've raised our children to be respectful of other people and other people's property." Their attitude was refreshing, and their first few months as tenants confirmed that we'd made an excellent choice. They paid rent early, communicated proactively about minor maintenance issues, and treated the property with the same care they'd show their own home. In contrast to the Walsh family's demands and complaints, the Martinez family approached their tenancy with gratitude and responsibility. When Elena called Sandra to report a small leak under the kitchen sink, she apologized for bothering us and offered to pay for the repair herself if it was caused by normal wear and tear. Elena, Sandra told me later, actually apologized for calling about a legitimate maintenance issue. Can you imagine? I could imagine, because I'd experienced both extremes of tenant behavior. The Walshes had called Sandra to demand property improvements that weren't their right to request. The Martinez family apologized for reporting actual problems that were the landlord's responsibility to fix. The difference wasn't just in their behavior, it was in their fundamental understanding of the rental relationship. The Martinez family understood that they were guests in someone else's property, while the Walsh family had acted as if they deserved whatever they could take. 6 months after the Walsh family moved out, I received an unexpected phone call from Jennifer. Her voice was subdued, lacking the confidence that had characterized our previous interactions. "Mrs. Henderson, I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted to thank you." I was genuinely surprised. Thank me for what? For teaching me something important about respect and appreciation. The past few months have been difficult, but they've also been educational. She went on to explain that their new housing situation had been a harsh introduction to the realities of the current rental market. Their new landlord was strictly business, raising rent annually to market rates and responding to maintenance requests with minimal urgency. They'd learned to appreciate amenities they'd taken for granted, like prompt repairs and stable rental rates. "I realize now how fortunate we were to rent from you," Jennifer continued. "You could have raised our rent to market rates at any time, but you didn't. You could have been difficult to work with, but you weren't. We had a good thing, and I ruined it with my big mouth and my assumptions." "What assumptions?" I asked. "I assumed that because you were elderly, you didn't understand business or property values. I assumed that because you lived modestly, you weren't smart about money. I assumed that because you weren't aggressive about maximizing rental income, you weren't a good businesswoman. And now? Now I understand that you were running your business exactly the way you wanted to run it. You were choosing to prioritize stable, long-term tenants over maximum short-term profits. You were choosing to treat people fairly rather than extracting every dollar you could get." Her insight was more sophisticated than I'd expected. "What changed your perspective?" "Our new landlord raised our rent $400 after the first year. When Derek asked about it, he said that's how business works in the current market. When our water heater broke, it took 2 weeks to get it repaired, because he uses the cheapest contractors he can find. When we asked about updating some of the older fixtures, he laughed and said we could pay for improvements ourselves if we didn't like the current condition." Jennifer paused. I realized that we'd been living with a landlord who actually cared about her tenants' welfare, and I'd been too stupid and arrogant to appreciate it. "Jennifer, I appreciate you calling to tell me this. Mrs. Henderson, I have one more thing to ask. I know you'll never rent to us again, and I understand why. But would you be willing to write a character reference for us? We're thinking about moving again, and most landlords want references from previous landlords." The request caught me off guard. After everything that had happened, Jennifer was asking me to help them secure new housing. What would you want me to say in such a reference? The truth. That we paid rent on time. That we took care of the property. But that we made mistakes in how we communicated and behaved as tenants. That we learned from those mistakes. I considered her request. Despite their disrespectful behavior, The Walsh family had indeed paid rent promptly and maintained the property physically. Their failures had been in attitude and communication rather than in basic tenant responsibilities. Jennifer, I'll write a reference that honestly describes your tenancy. I'll note both your strengths and your areas for improvement. That's more than fair, she said, her voice thick with gratitude. Thank you. After we hung up, I found myself reflecting on the entire experience. The Walsh family saga had begun with mockery of my old purse and ended with a grudging acknowledgement of my business acumen. It had evolved from their assumptions about elderly incompetence to their recognition that experience and wisdom might have value after all. But more than vindication, the experience had given me something I hadn't expected: a renewed sense of purpose and agency. For too many years after Frank's death, I'd allowed other people to manage my affairs and make assumptions about my capabilities. I'd been passive in my own life, accepting others' judgments about what I needed and what I could handle. The confrontation with the Walsh family had forced me to step into my role as a business owner and decision-maker. It had reminded me that I had both the right and the responsibility to set standards and enforce boundaries. Most importantly, it had shown me that respect wasn't something I should hope for or request. It was something I could demand. The phone call from Jennifer had been satisfying not because she'd finally acknowledged my competence, but because she'd learned something valuable about assumptions and respect. Her harsh introduction to the realities of dealing with profit-maximizing landlords had given her perspective on the value of fairness and consideration in business relationships. A year later, my property portfolio was performing better than ever. The Martinez family had signed a long-term lease and become community ambassadors for respectful tenancy. The Morrison family had referred friends who were looking for rental housing, leading to waiting lists for my other properties. Word had spread quietly through Millbrook's rental market that my properties were well-maintained and fairly priced, but that I expected tenants who understood the value of mutual respect. I'd also made some changes in my personal life. The old leather purse that had caused so much amusement still accompanied me everywhere, but now I carried it with a different kind of confidence. It no longer felt like a source of embarrassment or a target for mockery. It felt like a symbol of authenticity and practicality, qualities that had served me well in business and in life. Eleanor and I had started an informal support group for older women who were dealing with dismissive treatment from younger family members or service providers. We met monthly at the library, sharing experiences and strategies for maintaining dignity and agency as we aged. The group had grown from our initial conversation to include a dozen women who found strength in recognizing that they weren't alone in facing ageism and condescension. Marcus and Sabrina had also adjusted their behavior toward me, though I suspected their motivation was more practical than philosophical. Once they understood the extent of my financial independence, their suggestions about downsizing and simplifying had mysteriously disappeared. Sabrina's offers to help update my wardrobe had been replaced by compliments on my classic style, and Marcus had stopped assuming that I needed guidance with financial decisions. The transformation in their treatment wasn't entirely welcome. I would have preferred genuine respect based on our relationship, rather than deference based on my net worth. But it was better than the dismissive condescension I'd endured for years, and it allowed family gatherings to be more pleasant for everyone involved. One Sunday evening in late autumn, as I sat on my front porch watching the neighborhood children play in the fallen leaves, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that morning in the coffee shop, when I'd been mocked for my old-fashioned purse. The woman who had silently endured those comments seemed like a different person from the woman who now confidently managed a multi-million-dollar property portfolio. The change hadn't been dramatic or sudden. It had been gradual, building from small acts of self-assertion to larger declarations of independence. Standing up to the Walsh family had been a catalyst, but the real transformation had been internal. A shift from accepting others' judgments about my worth to trusting my own assessment of my capabilities and value. My old leather purse sat on the table next to my chair, its worn surface catching the light from the porch lamp. Inside, along with the usual contents, were the property deeds that had surprised so many people who'd made assumptions about the harmless old woman with the outdated accessories. But the real power hadn't been in the documents themselves. It had been in the knowledge that I was more than what I appeared to be, more capable than others assumed, more valuable than they recognized. The purse had been a symbol of others' prejudices, but it had become a reminder of my own strength. Tomorrow, I would meet with Sandra to review applications for a new property I was considering purchasing. The rental market remained strong, and my success with respectful tenants had convinced me to expand my portfolio. I was no longer the passive inheritor of Frank's investments. I was an active business owner, making strategic decisions based on my own judgment and experience. The woman who had once been dismissed as an incompetent elderly property owner was now sought out by other investors for advice on tenant relations and property management. The woman who had been mocked for her old-fashioned appearance was now respected for her business acumen and fair dealing practices. The woman who had been seen as an obstacle to younger people's ambitions was now recognized as someone who understood both the housing market and the importance of treating people with dignity. But perhaps most importantly, the woman who had once doubted her own worth now knew exactly who she was and what she brought to the world. She was Rose Henderson, property owner, businesswoman, and someone who had learned that respect isn't given based on age or appearance or fashionable accessories. Respect is earned through fair dealing, consistent principles, and the courage to stand up for what's right. As the evening grew cooler and the children were called inside for baths and bedtime stories, I gathered up my old leather purse and went inside to my comfortable home on Elm Street. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight I was content to be exactly who I was, a woman who had discovered her own power and wasn't afraid to use it. The coffee shop queens would never know how wrong they'd been about the old lady with the ancient purse, but that was their loss, not mine. I knew the truth, and that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.